sociology, culture and communication, social movements, tourism and recreation, and also about social movements. Title of his today's lecture is Social Movements, Fossil Fuel Extraction and Renewable Energy Transition, Localized Contention or Systematic Resistance. Professor Stoddart will talk for about an hour, then we'll open the stage for questions, reflections, comments, and so on. So that's all from me. The word is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. This is a wonderful sized crowd. It's really great to see the energy for this event. I wanted to thank the organizers very much for the invitation to come and participate. Is that loud enough? I usually can go at the back of the room. That works. Oh, a little bit louder? Yeah. No? Okay. Yeah. Great. Anyways, I want to share some work that I've been up to based on a few different projects around social movement mobilization and energy issues. So offshore oil, fossil fuel development, but also renewable energy transitions. And just as a starting point, basically I want to ask these couple of questions, and I'm gonna go over quite a few different case studies. So we're not going to dig that into depth on any particular case, but answer these questions a bit. When we look at episodes of contention, of mobilization around the fossil fuel sector and renewable energy transitions, particularly looking at Canada and Northern Europe, who are the key social movement actors and what forms of critique do they adopt? To give away a bit of the theoretical kind of punchline, I think what we do tend to see is a real range between what are very much localized controversies, things that remain kind of in the local context for movements, out to more types of anti-systemic or systematic critiques. And at the same time, when we look at movements, particularly in Canada, there's also a range between movements grounded more in environmental bases of mobilization, environmental organizations, movement organizations, and movements more grounded in kind of indigenous mobilization or movements, indigenous rights kind of perspectives, right? So we're going to explore kind of a range of cases around energy development, fossil fuel extraction, and so on, that kind of help us fill out this kind of double spectrum a bit, this double kind of continuum, right? And understand a bit of that kind of range of social bases of mobilization and forms of critique. The big argument, I guess I would want to leave you with, just to get this out right at the front end, is that when we start paying attention to contention around both fossil fuel or oil extraction and renewable energy, I think we really start to see that there is no such thing as innocent energy, right? All energy has a social or environmental impact, right? And they're kind of made contentious in different ways. And some impacts are worse than others and so on, but there isn't kind of a pure or innocent energy. So what I want to argue for today is a bit more of a systematic kind of energy justice perspective, right? A bit more holistic energy justice perspective on fossil fuel extraction and the kind of renewable energy transitions that are increasingly necessary as we live in a climate-constrained world, right? That are ongoing. So before we dig into the actual case studies, I also want to do a bit of theoretical kind of work at the front end, just give you a bit of a sense of where I'm doing this work from these days. I'm not going to get too in-depth in this figure, other than to say that I work more and more from what I think of as a kind of networked political ecology perspective. This is basically a figure from an article that came out a couple of years ago in Sociological Quarterly that explains this a little more. Always happy to share anything I reference today. I'm happy to share if you want to email me as well. I can send to you. But basically thinking about social ecological relationships as kind of a network of networks, right? And a lot of my research, as was said in the introduction, focuses on oil and resource extraction. A lot of it also focuses on tourism development and tourism economies, and how these things sometimes come into conflict, how they coexist, when they don't coexist, what's going on. So in terms of my own work, I tend to think of these as these kind of intersections of political networks, including social movements, kind of governance systems and so on, economic networks related to the tourism sector or the energy sector, mobility networks, kind of the networks of travel and kind of often very fossil fuel intensive kind of hypermobilities associated with things like tourism, for example, communication networks and so on and so forth, and also ecological networks, right, that are all very intertwined and very intimately intertwined. Part of my own conceptualization of political ecology that I think is consistent with most other folks is that I do see it very much as multi-scalar, so that we need to be attentive to what's going on from the more micro-social level right up to the more macro-social kind of structural level. And also that all of these networks are intimately bound up with kind of forms of power, right, around inclusion, exclusion, who is kind of central or powerful or influential within these various networks of networks, right? So that's kind of my bigger picture way of thinking about this stuff these days. But what we're going to focus on today is a little more on this relationship in particular, how environmental movements and indigenous movements kind of work to try and influence economic networks around energy use, energy extraction, renewable energy transitions. So that's kind of the piece that we're going to hone in on a bit more today. Another thing I want to start with theoretically is also John Urry's idea of the carbon complex. I think it's also very important to when we think about social movement mobilization around fossil fuels and around things like renewable energy transitions. Right? Term from John Urry from his 2013 book on oil and society, and he starts off with the most obvious part of carbon capital, right? The oil and gas sector, the folks that actually engage in exploration, extraction activity, and so on. Right? That's kind of the really obvious bit of who carbon capital is, the Shells, the Exxons, the BPs of the world, right? But he says it's actually broader than this as well. We should also be thinking of the carbon complex as constituted by, transportation and shipping sectors, air travel, car travel, marine shipping, and so on. Also very bound up in this kind of carbon complex. And taking a bit further, these are also sectors that have huge amounts of influence over the mass media, especially in host societies of kind of oil industries. And they're also hugely influential on the governments of oil-dependent regions, such as where I live, for example. On the east coast of Canada, where about 30% of our provincial revenues come from the oil sector, money. So the oil sector has a massive influence on governments. And even in the national level right now in Canada, we have a Liberal government that continues to proclaim their kind of green credentials, their interest in meeting the Paris COP agreement, at the same time that they also are using public money essentially to buy up pipelines, right, and support the Alberta oil sands. So you see this kind of very interesting relationship. So Urry says, this is, when we think of the carbon complex, this is the stuff we usually start thinking about, but it's actually a lot broader than that, right, especially in oil-dependent regions of the world, host regions. And that the power of the carbon complex is economic, it is political, it is cultural, and it's also military. If you've paid any attention to, U.S. kind of operations throughout the world over the last 30 years, it's pretty obvious that there's a military dimension to this as well, right, for example. This also resonates nicely with other key people that write about fossil capitalism or carbon capitalism. So Alt-Vader, Angela Carter, a collaborator of mine in Alberta, or in Ontario rather, Bron Dzerzhinsky, kind of a theorist in the UK, Lancaster. They also talk about this idea that, that fossil fuel economies are very central to where we are as a capitalist society. Going back to the web this morning, right? The web that we're stuck in, that webbing is made of fossil-intensive energy systems to a very large degree, right? And that's something we really need to figure out, well, how can we poke at that web in terms of transitions away from these fossil fuel-intensive energy systems? And so by looking at this set of case studies of social movements, we maybe start to see what might be more effective for severing some of those strands of that web, right? That's very, this kind of carbon complex kind of web. As I mentioned, I also want to put a pitch in for kind of an energy justice perspective. This is a really interesting body of literature that's emerging over the last couple of years that comes a lot from environmental justice kind of traditions, but really arguing that there are socially structured inequalities in which groups have access to affordable, reliable energy, and which groups are put at risk or at stake for energy extraction. So that's kind of the distributional dimension, right? Who gets privileged access to energy resources, who's put at risk for that extraction, right? But then there's also a procedural dimension. Which groups and interests are included or excluded from decision-making about the risks and benefits of energy production and distribution, right? And there I'm just giving you a few kind of key recent sites that you might want to follow up on, but this way of kind of framing environmental justice specifically around energy issues, right? The distributional and procedural dimensions of energy issues. And as I mentioned at the front, one of the main things I hope you take away from today is this kind of more holistic framework for thinking about energy. I think is really important when we think about doing things like renewable energy transitions, right? And ensuring they're done in ways that don't exacerbate social inequalities, right? And so on. Put some groups at risk, as we'll see. So the last kind of figure, kind of more theoretical points I wanted to bring is kind of specific to some stuff that I've been working on offshore oil recently and the dimensions of energy justice. Not going to talk too much today about this side, but the kind of privileged access to energy resources and the kinds of legitimating discourses that gets used for privileged access to things like offshore oil by a handful of corporations. More today we're going to focus over on this side and really about how movements are focusing in on or mobilizing around environmental risk and environmental injustice. And they do so in ways that sometimes focus more on the local risks, things like, we think offshore oil, risks to fisheries economies, risks to tourism economies, and so on, or the global risks. So focusing more on climate change, climate justice, things like that, right? The kind of more macro scale. Yeah. So I'm going to come back to this at the end after we've explored some case studies and kind of unpack that a little bit more. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to do a bit of a kind of a thin skim through several different controversies, several different cases, more so than try and dig too in depth, because I think by doing so, we're going to see a couple of interesting patterns that I find really fascinating, and I think will tie us into a nice theoretical argument at the end about how movements might be more successful at kind of, nudging on those spider webs that they're very kind of fossil fuel intensive. First, I'm going to draw from some discussion that's in a book chapter recently, the Oxford Handbook of Energy and Society, looking at the Alberta oil sands, kind of the main site of oil extraction in Canada, but also look a bit at some controversies over fracking, hydraulic fracturing in Atlantic Canada, in New Brunswick, and my own province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm also going to draw on some cases from a much bigger ongoing project that I'm kind of a little more than halfway through and working on a book from right now around industrial development and ecotourisms. Is coexistence possible between oil exploration and nature conservation? A book that's will be with Palgrave, and if theoretically, knock on wood, will be out in about 2 years. So it's still a ways off. But there we're also looking at Atlantic Canada, controversies over offshore oil development in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, off the west coast of Newfoundland Island. Also at kind of some stuff around fracking in that province. Also in that book, though, we look at kind of Norway and some of the conflicts and controversies over Lofoten Islands up in the Norwegian Arctic and the extension of oil exploration and extraction into the Barents Sea and into the north end of the Norwegian Sea, right? And that's also where we start to see some interesting stuff around controversies and mobilization around renewable energy, and some places where renewable energy transitions are also being made problematic or being questioned, at least, which I think become very interesting because I think it gets back to that point that there is no innocent energy, right? If we just assume that kind of the renewable energy and transition will go smoothly and uncontested, we're going to miss out on some tension that's going to come up, right? Some conflict that's going to come up. Right? So we'll dig into that a bit as well. And finally, drawing on another recent Oxford Handbook chapter, we'll also talk a bit about Arctic oil campaigns, or campaigns against Arctic oil development, not for Arctic oil development, and also a little bit about fossil fuel divestment movements. So we're going to touch on a lot of different cases, kind of in brief, that help us fill in that kind of map of, kind of local to global, but also environmental and indigenous social bases of mobilization. All right, so to jump right in with these various episodes of contention, I want to start with Alberta and the Alberta oil sands, tar sands, or bitumen sands, depending on what language we want to use collectively. The really most scientifically accurate name is the bitumen sands. Oil sands tends to get used more by people that like the Alberta oil sands. Tar sands tends to get used more by people who don't like it. So you have all three options there. And, I'm not sure, is that something that most of you would be familiar with by kind of show of hands? It's only a couple or few. Yeah. So it's a pretty energy-intensive form of energy extraction. Basically involves really mining oil-rich sands from northern Alberta, refining them into oil. It actually has a pretty low energy return on energy invested compared to a lot of other sources of oil. So it's very energy-intensive, very water-intensive, and creates some pretty profound risks to downstream communities in terms of water pollution potentially, also in terms of bird and wildlife impacts because of tailings ponds where waste is stored. And a lot of the mobilization around these risks has been by indigenous groups, because it's often downstream indigenous communities who are most impacted by water pollution as well as by impacts to fish and wildlife in northern Alberta because of oil sands development. So indigenous communities such as the Cree, the Dene, the Métis have often been very opposed to this, right? And as pipeline projects are kind of also becoming increasingly controversial, you also see indigenous groups that have been very much opposed to pipeline projects, while some other groups have been supportive for economic rationales. But in general, indigenous communities have often really been at the forefront of some of these issues over the Alberta oil sands. The kind of critiques that are being used are often around localized environmental health impacts downstream, kind of on the Athabasca River watershed. But there's also a more systemic critique that links into kind of Euro-Canadian colonialism of North America, right? And that really also frames oil sands extraction in Alberta as a continuation of colonialism in Canada, as linked to this kind of removal of indigenous resources and leaving behind the environmental risks, right, of water pollution and so on, impacts on wildlife. So this has often also been framed in terms of broader movements for indigenous recognition and resurgence, such as the Idle No More movement in Canada, for example. And so here we see that there is this kind of call to both distributional and procedural dimensions of energy justice, right? At the same time, there's also been a lot of environmental organizations that have also been involved in campaigns around the Alberta oil sands, including kind of Canadian national groups like the David Suzuki Foundation, Pembina Institute, and so on, as well as larger international organizations like the World Wildlife Fund, right? However, their form of critique has tended to be pretty different. It's mostly been oriented around wildlife conservation, habitat conservation, some attention to downstream environmental health impacts, and that's really where you would see some overlap between environmental groups and indigenous groups, but also more attention or focus on Canadian climate change performance and policy, and framing the Alberta oil sands as a bit, kind of this ironic thing for a country that's supposed to be interested in climate change policy, right? We're a country with a small population relatively, that's one of the worst per capita carbon footprints in the world, right? We're right up there with Australia in terms of per capita carbon footprints, and the US and a few others, handful of others, despite being a relatively small country population-wise. However, there have been some really interesting bridging efforts, things like the Tar Sands Healing Walk, kind of projects, other initiatives that have started building more alliances across the kind of indigenous and environmental bases of mobilization and collective action, right? That kind of make those links a bit more explicit, that these are kind of a bundle of problems that are actually related, right? As these groups have kind of networked with each other more increasingly, created working alliances and so on. But that's something that we don't see a lot of. That's actually probably the exception of the cases I'm going to talk about, where we see a stronger, maybe kind of alignment between environmental, social bases, and indigenous. By contrast, if we turn to fracking, hydraulic fracturing in Atlantic Canada, what we tend to see is a bit of a separation, right? Similar kind of discourses, but differently in different places, right? So first in New Brunswick, in the community of Elsipogtog, which is a Mi'kmaq community in the east coast of Canada, key actors who have opposed fracking development there have been the Mi'kmaq community, kind of supported by settler allies, but pretty grassroots, not working through large organizations or environmental organizations for the most part. And most of the critique has been around local environmental health risks from fracking, so water pollution in particular. But again, like we see in the oil sands, this idea that energy extraction is also linked to a critique of Canadian colonialism, right? These legacies of colonialism, of removing indigenous resources from indigenous land and leaving behind the environmental risks, right, for indigenous communities, right? By contrast, over in my province, in Newfoundland and Labrador, a few hundred kilometers away on island, there's also been controversies over fracking and opposition around fracking. But it's taken kind of a different form, and it's taken a different form of critique, interestingly. And there what we've tended to see is similarly kind of community-based, grassroots kind of networks of groups called fracking awareness networks that haven't really been as grounded in indigenous social bases of mobilization, more in environmental concerns, kind of narrowly defined. And some of these groups have been supported by larger environmental groups like CPAWS, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And their critique tends to be a bit different, right? Their form of critique. More around protecting kind of the nature, the kind of the natural beauty and integrity, ecological integrity of Gros Morne National Park in particular, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well as a national park on the west coast of Newfoundland Island. And part of the rationale for that is that Gros Morne is a very important tourism region. It's probably one of the most well-visited rural regions in the province, right? That's got a very vibrant tourism economy. It's got fisheries locally as well. So really, the kind of form of critique there tends to be focused on protecting local tourism economies, not so much linked to these kind of broader critiques, these more systemic critiques. Some connection to climate change, but mostly it's about maintaining the integrity ecologically of kind of Gros Morne National Park, tourism economies, that kind of stuff. So same form of energy extraction, two regions that are a few hundred kilometers apart from each other, and completely different bases of mobilization and forms of critique, which is very interesting, I think. Personally, I find really interesting. And we move to another project, and here you can actually see a map of where we're talking about here with Newfoundland and Labrador, the island being here. Gros Morne National Park is just up here a little ways. New Brunswick, where I was just talking about, is just over here. There's also a proposal for an offshore oil project called Old Harry that would be positioned about 100 kilometers or so from Newfoundland. It's just inside the provincial territorial boundary, which puts it under provincial jurisdiction. But as you can see, it's in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so the body of water that's surrounded by 5 Canadian provinces on the Atlantic coast. And it's also drawn some attention, some controversy, for kind of similar reasons, right? And here we see kind of the key actors being largely local environmental groups, much as we saw with the fracking case, often amplified by national organizations, such as the David Suzuki Foundation in particular. But here we've also seen regional alliances kind of around the whole region with tourism operators, community organizations, indigenous groups, fishers associations, fishers groups, all that kind of stuff. And really this kind of concern around the region. So a bit of a delocalization in that sense, right? Seeing it a bit more on a broad scale, because ultimately, the exploratory work here has impacts on whales and wildlife throughout the region in terms of seismic testing and fisheries and so on. But also if it were developed and there was ever a spill, this is a place that's much more contained than the Gulf of Mexico in the United States with much rougher weather, right? We're talking about pretty severe winds, sea ice, all that kind of stuff. So the form of critique around here that we tend to see is really around protecting local tourism and fisheries economies, similar to kind of the fracking in Newfoundland and Labrador, but also a critique that's about contesting the political jurisdiction of Old Harry's development, right? This idea that that any benefits or revenues from this project would go to the provincial government of Newfoundland and Labrador, but the risks would be borne by the entire region, which is 5 provinces, right? So you do see this questioning of the distributional dimension of energy justice in that sense. This idea that, that the province of Newfoundland and Labrador is essentially putting the entire region at risk for its own benefit, right? Where, of course, all the assessment of processes, all the public engagement is then run through Newfoundland and Labrador as the province that this development is slightly inside the territorial boundaries of. So moving away from Canada then, I also want to talk a little bit about northern Norway, where I've been doing research and carrying out field work over the last couple of years as well. And another case I think has become very fascinating is Lofoten Islands, and the kind of push into the Norwegian Arctic as more oil fields in the Norwegian Sea become post-peak, and so on. And Norway, like Canada, very dependent on its fossil fuel revenues, on its oil industry, and so on. But that's becoming challenged by environmental groups as the kind of boundaries of exploration push northwards, push out into places like Lofoten. Right? There's been talk about having both a national park in Lofoten and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, neither of which has happened yet, but it's become a place where oil expansion has become very contested. And here we see that the key actors are an interesting blend. And this is also something I find really unique in this set of cases. You see international environmental organizations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, being active on this issue, as well as national Norwegian organizations such as Bellona and Nature and Youth, which is the anglicized name because my Norwegian is horrible. So I'm using the anglicized name for Nature and Youth there. And then you also have like grassroots groups, local groups, like Oil Free Lofoten. They're much more grassroots oriented. So I think what we see in this case that we don't see in most of the Canadian cases, or not to the same degree, is what we might call a really complex social movement ecology from local, national, international groups kind of coming together around this issue. Right? The closest in the Canadian cases would probably be the Alberta oil sands that we see to this kind of complex social movement ecology. And the forms of critique this generates are quite interesting. So we do see, like Newfoundland and Labrador, a focus on the localized risks of oil development. So how oil might have negative impacts on the tourism economy, on the fisheries economy of the region. As a research informant put it to me, and I think pretty much captures the sense in Lofoten broadly, is fisheries is the most important. Everything else we do here has to respect the fisheries. Tourism is the second most important. We can only do tourism insofar as it respects the fisheries. Oil, if it happens, is the third most important, and oil should really only happen if it can be done in a way that respects the fisheries and tourism. For some folks, actually I'd say for a lot of folks, oil is not compatible with tourism and fisheries. For others, it's like, well, if we can do oil in a way that respects the fisheries and the oil and the tourism, then we kind of move ahead with it. But it's contentious, right? But we also see in the Lofoten case, this is also often linked to kind of the global risks of climate change and to a discourse of climate justice, right? That's quite interesting. And this idea that basically, Norway has now spent a few decades getting very wealthy, having a very high standard of living because of its fossil fuel wealth. And that, what I've heard from several environmental group participants as well, if any country in the world now can afford to leave it in the ground, surely it must be Norway, right? And let the rest of the world kind of continue onwards, right? You get a very different image from the energy sector and government, but amongst social movement actors, this kind of climate justice discourse that's quite interesting. Most recently, last summer of last year, this was actually formalized into the Lofoten Declaration, which is signed on to by quite a range of environmental groups, academic researchers, and so on, and people that are basically saying, that we shouldn't be expanding the Norwegian oil frontiers further, right? Norway's had its turn at oil wealth, right? That if it's a country that really is serious about its climate change commitments, it should remain a closed area for fossil fuel expansion. There's also kind of broader campaigns around Arctic oil development that have often targeted been targeted at the Russian government, at Gazprom, for example, in the Russian Arctic, have also been targeted at kind of Norway, at companies like Shell, which is mostly withdrawn from its Arctic oil exploration program right now. If you're not familiar with this, this is an image from Greenpeace's campaign a few years ago to try and get Lego to drop its contracts with Shell. Shell was a supplier of raw materials for the plastics and Lego and all that stuff. There's some really clever YouTube videos that do a great job of playing with the whole Lego thing. And the campaign was basically successful. Lego abandoned its relationship with Shell. Shell ultimately withdrew from its Arctic exploration program. Basically Greenpeace said, we won, it's because of our campaign. Shell said, well, it's because it was 2014 and oil prices tanked globally, so Arctic oil exploration doesn't make sense economically. Probably a little column A, a little column B in that situation. Anyway, it's a campaign that was quite interesting, right? And the key actors there tended to be groups like Greenpeace and the WWF, tends to be really international organizations in that campaign, in the kind of no to Arctic oil. And most of the critique there really is around climate change, climate justice to a certain extent, but really around climate change and in opposition to expanding the frontiers of oil exploration, fossil fuel exploration into the Arctic, right? One of the things this campaign does is really plays into a whole discourse of an idea of a global Arctic. That's kind of an object of global political concern, scientific concern, and ecological concern. And as many people have been critical of that for saying that global Arctic kind of framing or basis of opposition then starts to really not pay so much attention to what's going on in local communities and how climate change is being experienced very differentially by communities in the Arctic, communities in the north. Bit of an aside, but I think also an important point. To me, this is an interesting example of a more maybe systemic, macro-social critique that almost does the opposite of some of the localized conflicts, right? It's kind of missing what's going on locally rather than missing what's going on globally sometimes. And finally, the final one of these fossil fuel campaigns I want to look at is divestment movements, because I think they're also extremely important and extremely interesting. And what we see with the divestment movement is it largely started in university campuses, and it's kind of emerged as a very grassroots kind of thing. It's been taken up by churches, by city governments, national governments, and so on. And then, environmental groups have kind of institutionalized around this, like Fossil Free, for example. But this has largely been driven from kind of grassroots campus communities, right? You don't really see a ton of involvement by the Greenpeaces and the WWFs that kind of quite the same way through the evolution of this movement. They're there, but they're not they weren't the driver, right? And the form of critique here, we really do see more of a climate justice kind of critique that it is morally wrong to profit from climate change via ongoing fossil fuel investment, right? But there's also a financial critique or financial logic, right? Using the logic of carbon capital to say, that as the world starts to take action on climate change, as the world shifts to renewable energy, if you continue to hold fossil fuel assets, you're going to be left with stranded assets, right? To kind of frame it in that language as well. So both a moral language of climate justice, but also the financial logic of the carbon complex. And I would say of all these groups we're talking about, or movements we're talking about, this is maybe one of the more systemic critiques of the carbon complexes that we see in the divestment movement. Makes it, I think, particularly fascinating. So that's kind of quite a range of groups and movements that are troubling fossil fuel extraction in various ways, that are critiquing fossil fuel extraction, opposing it. But I think the next place I want to go is to ask then, well, what about this transition to renewable energy? These transitions to renewable energy, low carbon futures. And interestingly, there's friction there as well. And this kind of came up really at the sides of some of these projects. I mean, really, originally we were looking at, kind of fossil fuel economies primarily, but then starting to realize, hey, there's actually there's movements that are also coming up against the renewable energy transition in different ways, shapes, and forms. So first off, to return to Newfoundland and Labrador, the Labrador part of my province, largely indigenous communities, the northern part of the province, a huge mega project that's kind of being built right now is the Muskrat Falls Dam. It's in the news every week, including when I woke up this morning, for being more and more and more over budget and incompetently managed and all this stuff. But part of its commissioning was to say this is how Newfoundland and Labrador will meet its climate change commitments and how we'll move to lower carbon forms of energy production and so on, right? What people started realizing was the dam risks creating a lot of downstream pollution for fish populations through methyl mercury poisoning, right? And that also downstream communities are worried about some of the construction of the dam, potentially, if it failed, creating flooding and completely wiping out downstream communities, right? And there are some pretty serious questions about the engineering of this project that people have. So there's downstream risks in terms of flooding, downstream risks in terms of methyl mercury poisoning of fish populations, and that's led to quite a bit of resistance, largely grounded in indigenous communities again, like the New Brunswick fracking case, like the Alberta oil sands. So it's mostly been kind of Inuit communities, particularly Nunatsiavut, Inuit, and Nunatuavut. Innu Nation, the other main indigenous community in Labrador, has been more supportive of the project, so it's not homogenous. There are some tensions within these different communities. But a lot of it's been through Nunatsiavut, Nunatuavut, with settler allies. And the forms of critique taken are, again, around localized environmental health impacts and safety risk, so fish populations. We're talking about remote northern communities where food security is often an issue, food affordability isn't often an issue. But when the issue of fish poisonings were brought up, one of our provincial politicians just said, well, you can just go to the store and buy canned fish like everyone else. The most tone-deaf things said by a Canadian politician in a very long time. But also these links, again, to broader movements of Indigenous recognition and resurgence, critiques of Canadian colonialism, and so on, right? So even though we're now talking about a renewable energy project, the forms of critique and bases of opposition are really similar to what we saw with the fracking campaign in New Brunswick and the Alberta oil sands, right? Which is really fascinating if we think about doing a just transition to renewable energy. And I teach, one of my standard courses I teach is oil and development. And for the last couple of years, we always talk about Masquerade Falls to say, just because it's renewable does not mean it's socially just, that it's, that it meets these kind of other criteria of social sustainability or social justice, right? So we can't make the mistake of just thinking because something can be labeled as green that it's going to be just, right? And I think that's a really, really important point here. In the work I've also been doing, though, in Northern Europe, you also see some interesting points of friction, coming more from kind of environmental groups often, in both Iceland and Denmark. So in Iceland, we've seen some opposition to the expansion of geothermal infrastructure. So Iceland's kind of a neat place. It's something over 90% of household energy use is actually renewable. It's incredibly rich in hydroelectricity and geothermal electricity. It's a bounty of renewable energy. And that said, though, at the same time, there's still some exploratory activity around offshore oil off the northeast coast, right? Exploration started before the prices of oil kind of went rapidly down around 2014-15. Icon Energy and CNOOC, the big Chinese oil company, are still doing exploratory work there. But what is interesting is in the last few years, there's been less kind of mobilization around oil exploration, as it's kind of fallen off the radar, and a bit more critique of the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure, right, and new renewable infrastructure, saying that basically this intrudes on the wilderness values of the Icelandic landscape, which are basically what supports the tourism boom, that creates a tourism image for the country, right? So some environmental groups have actually said, renewable energy is not, it's a bit contested as well for these reasons, that it might actually impact this kind of tourism economy, essentially, or tourism image. Similarly, in Denmark, conflicts that are mostly, I'd say, done at this point, that they're not really an ongoing thing as much, but around wind energy development. And especially with onshore wind, there was opposition that tended to be very kind of local grassroots communities, largely driven by kind of farmers and kind of agricultural communities. Some of that, though, getting support from environmental groups like the Danish Ornithological Society because of kind of impacts on bird populations of wind energy and so on. And here we see a critique that's a bit different, right? It's our kind of more, what we'd often think of as classic kind of NIMBYism, right? Of too much noise in my community. They're just kind of the aesthetics are kind of wrong. But these are critiques that did help push offshore wind development much more than onshore. So there's very little onshore wind development at this point. It's kind of much more a push towards offshore wind now, where it's away from these communities. Right? So all that's to say, if we go back to mapping the field of cases, and we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of cases and kind of brief, but what we see is this interesting way we might think about social movement intervention and opposition around fossil fuels and renewable energy transitions, right? Where we see things like the campaigns around fracking in Newfoundland and Labrador and the Old Harry campaign, but also renewable energy campaigns in Iceland and Denmark, right? Probably most campaigns around energy development fall into this quadrant. They're based in environmental concerns, and they're pretty localized, right? They're limited to a particular development project in a particular region. And I would say for at least fields of, the areas I work, this is probably the norm, as most things kind of fall into that quadrant, right? Not a lot of systemic kind of thinking going around the carbon complex, for example. By contrast, you get movements, I would say like the divestment movement, and maybe to a lesser extent the Save the Arctic movement, that tend to take a much broader, maybe more anti-systemic kind of approach to things, tend to be very based in environmental bases of mobilization, but maybe tend to pay less attention to what's going on at the local community level and why these might be of concern for local communities, right? And then we get places like Lofoten, which I think is an interesting one, where it's very much grounded in environmental concerns, environmental mobilization, bases of mobilization, but it kind of tends to bridge both. The claims are about the local impacts, but also has this more anti-systemic kind of critique of the carbon complex, of Norway's place in a decarbonizing, carbon-constrained kind of world, right? It has kind of both forms of critique going on, which I think makes it a very interesting case. At the other end of the vertical axis, we have groups that are more grounded in indigenous bases of mobilization. Even though they're completely concerned often with environmental health issues, they're also framed very much through the language of indigenous rights, right? And critiques of colonization, and so on, right? Even though they are also, I say, like concerned with environmental issues, certainly. But that's things like fracking in New Brunswick, but also hydroelectric development in Labrador, Muskrat Falls. So here again, you see in both of these cases, similar critiques, even though we're talking about fossil fuels and renewable energy, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing. And finally, the Alberta oil sands, which is where I think we kind of see both spectrums being bridged. You have indigenous groups and environmental groups talking about kind of indigenous rights bases of mobilization as well as environmental, talking about the local impacts as well as the more kind of systemic kind of perspectives on things, right? So that's just kind of a mapping out of all that stuff that we just kind of talked about, synthesizing it a little bit. But what does all that mean, right? Kind of try to explain this theoretically. I mean, I think we can argue that, at least personally, the more interesting cases tend to be the ones that do this bridging, from my perspective, right? That actually connect what's going on locally with the more anti-systemic kind of perspectives that don't fall either into a more abstracted globalism or maybe a more myopic localism, right? These cases kind of tend to do a nice job of bridging the two, right? And I think one thing that we see is, if we go back to this figure, it's like, well, fracking, Old Harry, that kind of stuff, it's local risks. We map it onto this figure as well. Divestment, Save the Arctic, it's global. And the Alberta oil sands, Lofoten, it's kind of bridging the two, right? So another way of just kind of mapping out the similar cases. But the final argument I would make with all of this, or two arguments, is what I think happens when we look at all these cases and compare them is that this bridging of local impacts and systemic critiques seems to be more likely where there is a richer social movement ecology, where you have networks of either environmental and indigenous bases of concern and movements, or where we have local, national, and international kind of groups and actors, right? That movement bridging tends to be conducive to doing this kind of bridging of types of critique as well, right? And not drifting into kind of abstract globalism or narrow localism, right? That kind of keeps the attention on both. And I think that's, from a social movement's perspective, I think that's kind of a really interesting thing to take away from that comparison of cases, right? About the importance of a rich social movement ecology that's local, that's national, that's international, and able to combine these forms of critique. So that takes me back to less than an hour, 48 minutes, to close up with the same main argument I started with that I hope you'll take away from this. is that when we start paying attention to controversy and mobilization around energy, I think it's really important not just to think about the fossil fuel side, because I think when we think about fossil fuel and renewable energy controversies, we do see that there is no innocent energy. The impacts are different, certainly. Certainly, the Alberta oil sands is very different from a wind farm in Denmark. But they all have things that people might find controversial about them in their in-host communities, right? They all raise different types of questions about energy justice. So I think it is really important to take on this more kind of systemic energy justice perspective as we think about not just how we get out of fossil fuel dependent, carbon complex dependent economies, but also as we move towards more kind of renewable energy transitions. And so we'll just leave it there and open it for discussion. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Now we open the stage for questions, reflections, comments, and so on. So just raise your hand and I'll give you the mic. Any questions?
I can get us started.
Okay.
While others are thinking how to verbalize their questions. I have two questions. One is maybe more appropriate for the Thursday roundtable, kind of wrapping up, and then one that's very much focused on your presentation today. And thank you, fabulous presentation. So first the maybe Thursday question. When you started your presentation and the focus was immediately on networks, and then you added at the bottom right of your slide various aspects of power, I believe, economic, political, and others. The question that came to my mind is the bigger picture, cross-disciplinary picture of what is the advantage, the theoretical lens advantage of thinking about environmental issues or political ecology using networks as the focus of the attention, right? So again, this may be more of a Thursday question when we all come together and start thinking about this big picture. And the other question to me was prompted by the two slides. One was environmental risk and injustice on one side and environmental privilege on the other. And the other one which had two dimensions, and the X on the X-axis on the right hand was anti-systemic movements. And my question to you is why is it that we have so many more movements on the risk side? Then we have movements on the issues that are more proactive, that have no specific, in the words of Andre from this morning, he said "kriek," which means scream in English, right? They have no risk that we can easily pinpoint, but they still have potentially big social impact. So specifically, we don't have oil, we don't have coal projects, we don't have anything that we could say this is going to cause mercury, air pollution, and so on and so forth. What about transmission lines? We don't have any specific risks beyond it's going to spoil landscape and maybe create problems for wildlife. How come we have fewer of those risks? How come we have fewer of those protests? And are they more difficult to organize? Are they more difficult to mobilize people about those more proactive long-term issues? And if that is indeed the case, how do we do that? Because those are probably equally challenging issues.
Yeah. Okay. Where to start with that? So I guess, I'll start with the first question, the maybe Thursday question. And, I think my big picture definition of political ecology that I said my first book came out a few years ago is kind of the working definition that I still like is just, a lens that's attentive to the intersections of politics, economics, and culture in relation to ecology and environmental problems. And I would also say power is a key dimension of what a political ecology lens brings, right, to the analysis that a lot of other environmental social science doesn't necessarily, right? So I think those, for me, are kind of defining characteristics. of political ecology as a lens. The reason, maybe I'll scroll back even to it, I like this kind of idea of a networked approach is really I like kind of network analysis, analytic type tools. And I think I just find it very useful. Sorry, it might take a while to scroll back to that one. Because it's back right there. I find network analytic kind of thinking is really useful for specifying relationships, right? And specifying, okay, well, who's actually being included and excluded in these spaces, right? And all that kind of stuff. And so I work a lot with David Tyndall in Canada, who's a quantitative networks person. I tend to be a bit more qualitatively oriented and more interested in narrative accounts of relationships within sectors and across sectors. So we've ended up writing some mixed method stuff on network analyses of environmental movements and conflicts. But I find, like, just through years of working with network analysis, the downside of a lot of network analysis thinking is it's not very theoretically rich sometimes. It's not very attuned to questions of power sometimes. But I do find them very powerful research tools, right, to embed in what I think is maybe a more interesting way to think about this stuff theoretically. I also think network thinking is great for trying to think on the intersection of different scales, right, to be able to think about individual interactions, but also like that organizational actors are also kind of nodes and networks, and that basically I really like the metaphor from network thinking that when we think of the macro scale, like kind of structure, the idea that what we're often seeing, social structure, I like this metaphor better from network thinking, that it's architecture through which relationships work, through which that our social structures really be architectures created by these relationships, right? And I kind of like that metaphor, maybe more than the old one of a structure that is like a building that's unchangeable and all that stuff. That it's kind of more like kind of an architecture in which things happen and move and can be changed and revised and rebuilt and stuff like that. So I think that's maybe that's that question to a certain degree. And then the other question was this slide, which is that one. So that's kind of from another working paper from some of this project or this research. So as I said, I wasn't going to talk too much about the privilege side, which is really about the privileged access of actors to environmental resources. So one of the things I'm interested in, though, as well, is how you get sectors like the oil sector that are incredibly dominated by a relatively small body of corporate actors, right? So how do societies that have oil holdings decide to give these actors privileged access? And people do it in kind of different ways. And what we tend to see is in places like Canada or the United States, there's often a legitimating discourse of global competitiveness, right? That, well, oil's a global market, we need to give Exxon our resources in a way that's globally competitive, and we'll get some royalties out of it. But then you get a very different legitimating discourse somewhere like Denmark or Norway that says, hey, this is our resources. We can use this, we can leverage, if you want access to this, leverage it for social well-being. We can use state ownership to create social well-being. So I think, that's, to me, the flip side, or the corollary of the kind of environmental risks produced by the fossil fuel sector, is how societies and policymakers think about how you negotiate privileged access to environmental resources as well. So I think that's something I kind of left aside because it's from a bit of a different paper, but I think that's kind of what that other side of that figure is kind of getting at. So somewhere like Newfoundland and Labrador, you really see in the policy sphere this kind of legitimating discourse of global competitiveness, whereas in the policy and practice sphere in Norway or Denmark, it's much more about legitimating the oil sector because of its contribution to social well-being, right? But I think what we see the most of, though, in terms of opposition, is a lot more of this focus on the local risk for the most part, right? And it becomes harder, I think, for movements to scale that up. Often, and I think in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, where I'm working, people tend to see the oil sector as the source of economic well-being, right? So what it tends to mean is that you get movements against specific projects that pose risks to economies that are already established around fisheries or tourism, but they're rarely going to step beyond that and say, but the oil sector in general is problematic, right? That we should be thinking about all this other stuff. And I think that's where the Norwegian case is maybe more interesting. The oil sands in Alberta is more interesting, where you do see a bit more of that bridging of different frames or different grievances, right? But I think it's just easier a lot of the time for movements to organize around the stuff that's in people's face more, right? That it's more perceptible, right? It's not as abstract. But then it also doesn't pose as radical a challenge to, our social well-being, our sense of, our participation as good consumers, all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. I think that hit most of it, but other people probably have stuff as well. I'll cap it there on that response. But.
Thank you. My question, as we see a climate or environmental yes, so environmental or climate injustice is more and more the reason why people are being brought together and fighting together for the cause, which I see in itself that this is a good thing, because this way we have more solidarity between people, movements are being built and so on.
Yep.
So my question from your presentation would be more on the environmental part, so on the outcome of these practices. So I don't know if these cases are they finished yet? Mm-hmm. If they are, what was the outcome? Or maybe if you could give us maybe a few key points, success factors, because this is a good opportunity for movements here in Slovenia to see what works. Yeah. Or if they are not finished, or if the outcome was negative, what are the lessons learned?
Yeah, and I think the Arctic campaign has largely, I think it's largely wound down, but I think I know, at the time that Shell pulled out, for example, Greenpeace kind of declared it a victory, but they pulled out of their Arctic exploration program like a couple months after the price of oil tanked, right? So the Shell press release says, Arctic oil is no longer economically feasible, we're kind of winding down our exploration program. Greenpeace's press release that came out like the same day said we won. So I think in that case, it becomes very hard to know strategic. So certainly, I think the Greenpeace and WWF campaign helped push that and made it easier for oil companies to say, okay, we're going to wind down our Arctic oil exploration program. It might make it, hopefully, if the price goes back up, hopefully it'll make companies think twice about rebooting those kind of exploration programs. In the Icelandic case, 2 oil companies are left in, exploring off the northeast coast. The other companies just let their exploration leases expire earlier this year and said, we're done, it doesn't make sense to be this far out in the Arctic right now. But there's that kind of, is it a global economic thing, or was it the social movements being successful, is really hard to tell, right? Lofoten is ongoing, but it's a really interesting one to watch. And I would say that's, as is the Alberta oil sands. I think they're both very interesting cases to watch. They're both ongoing. And where Lofoten is having success is they've been delaying oil exploration for close to 2 decades now, I think. It's still a closed area. Every new national election in Norway, it kind of comes back up as a point of discussion, but the exploration licenses have not been signed. It's still a closed area. So the problem is an indefinite kind of delaying and moratorium, is that a victory, right? Until somebody eventually says, okay, this is just a closed area, we're not going to go there. But the Lofoten Declaration is really interesting. A couple of Norwegian colleagues have been writing about this quite a bit. So Berit Christoffersen, who's a collaborator on the work I'm doing there as well, she's published quite a bit on Lofoten oil controversies. Britt Dale as well. So I'd say from a social movements perspective, what they've done really well is, to me, that networking of local grassroots groups, national organizations and international organizations, and where they have kept the focus on the local concerns that local communities can really grab onto, like, hey, we don't want to mess up our fisheries, we don't want to mess up our tourism economy. At the same time, they also have a critique that's grounded in climate justice and Norway's climate change commitments, right? So I think they've done a really cool job, both in terms of a broad base of support, and I think that's part of the secret of success, and then also able to speak to people, in like a village like Reina in Lofoten, who's like somebody who's a sea kayak operator, who, actually what he cares about is he still going to have a business in 10 years, right, or she? But then also be able to go to Oslo and speak to people and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be extending our oil frontiers while we're also say we're concerned about climate change. So I think that's cases like Lofoten and the Alberta oil sands both show similar dynamics. They're both ongoing. Neither of them have really been a success yet. But I would say they're a nice model in the sense that they bridge movements very well, and they bridge the forms of critique between the local and the kind of more systemic, the more global, right? Because I think the risk of a campaign like divestment or some of the Arctic oil campaigns is they can feel very abstract from people's everyday realities, right? They don't necessarily resonate as much at the community level. And in fact, the Arctic oil campaign has been critiqued a lot by Indigenous communities in the North, by Inuit communities for being so abstracted, so globalized, like this high level thing where, it's all about polar bears, not the fact that Indigenous communities in the North are being very disproportionately impacted by climate change already, right? When Greenpeace mostly ends up focusing on like climate bear or polar bears. So the term polar bear politics has come up for critiquing this more abstracted globalism of things like the Arctic kind of campaigns, for example. But I hope that gets mostly there, yeah.
Any more questions?
One or two questions. First, about trade unions. We're talking just about, environmental organization, indigenous communities, and so on. And I've done some research on trade unions and climate change in my bachelor thesis. So I'm interested in what's the role of the trade unions here in this example. Are they just a negative factor, just siding with the capital, or can they be a positive agent?
Right.
And the second question is about progressive left-wing parties. Drawing from your research, what are the most common social movements' attitudes towards progressive left-wing parties?
Right.
And also, how do you see these relations between social movements and progressive left-wing parties?
Sure. Okay, well, I'll start with Canada, because it's the case I know much better. And their unions in the oil sector have not tended to be very activist or radical on this stuff. However, there's a really interesting organization called Iron and Earth that's driven by labor unions in primarily kind of emerged in Canada and Alberta, and it's basically oil sector workers calling for a just transition to renewable energy. There's a very, very small chapter that's recently started in St. John's, where I live, but it's not that active yet. So I'd say there is a very, there's a minority within labor unions who are more reflexive about the idea of needing a just transition, kind of just renewable transitions. They haven't been major actors in Canadian politics around this stuff, nearly as much as environmental groups or Indigenous communities. In terms of progressive politics and parties, it depends a lot on the province. So Canada's very regionalized. Each province has very different cultures. It's a massive, massive country. So I did my graduate work in British Columbia on the west coast of the country. I now live and work on the east coast of the country. Moving from one to the other took 10 days of driving. That's kind of how big we're talking about here. So it's very varied on a regional level. So there actually is a left progressive government in Alberta right now, the New Democratic Party, but they've been very limited on what they've done around the oil sands. They've been not very critical of the oil sands sector. And you can be generous and say they've been as critical as they can get away with in a major oil area. But similarly in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have a progressive kind of party that, they're pretty good on social justice stuff, but they're not really rocking the boat around oil much, right? You're not going to really hear them talk critically about the oil sector. Although you might hear them say, well, we need to do more around offshore wind investment, things like that, like so the kind of the positive alternatives. What I've heard in my research in Norway, less on the union side, more on the opposition party side, is it's actually been alliances with opposition parties that have been very important as well to the success of social movements. That often the governing party has not been that sympathetic, but if you can build an alliance with the opposition parties, that's helped keep the Lofoten area closed, right? And that's been really important in that setting, is that you've got this kind of leverage from opposition parties that's quite different. Yeah.
Did NDP endorse the manifesto?
No. One prominent NDP leader tried to, and it became a big issue in the media because of the Canadian reliance on the Alberta oil sands. So right now you actually have an NDP government in British Columbia that's opposed to new pipeline development That's basically, you've now got this kind of brewing kind of mini civil war between BC and Alberta going on in the west of Canada right now, both of which have NDP governments right now. And the Alberta NDP wants pipelines to go through to the BC coast. The BC NDP government does not. The federal government's been siding with Alberta so far. So that's got a lot of protest going on by Indigenous groups and environmental groups around kind of stopping pipeline expansion and so on. And actually the Federal Court of Canada just struck down all the approvals for the Trans Mountain pipeline just 3 days ago, around Indigenous rights claims, claimed legal challenges launched by Indigenous groups. So that's kind of been interesting, where you see two NDP governments fighting against each other over the question of whether we should be building pipelines or not. But that's where Canada's at right now. Yeah. So,
Just to add a small comment to that on the trade union movement and environmentalism. In Australia in 1970s, we had a green bands, a green trade union movement, which is the Builders Labourers Federation, and they really held the city to ransom in terms of undesirable building projects, developments, or heritage sites that might be damaged by development. And a really nice aspect of this was the early days of feminism, and the builders' labourers told the university they would put a green ban on the university, any building sites, unless the Vice-Chancellor gave the women a women's study centre.
Kako po vašem mnenju vpliva geografija?
Oh, I don't have my. Yeah.
Okay. I will try in English. What do you think personally? How to geographic number people on some area have to influence, effect to politics around the people's sensibility, I think.
Like, where is a tipping point when change will start to happen, you mean, in terms of numbers?
Slovenia is very small. We have 300 people per, I think so, kilometer, but in Canada you have a lot of green space, and how people touch these problems, because you are educated men, but the ordinary people, how they look.
Yeah.
We talk here for small people, how people react to politics for ecology in Canada.
I think it can be so different issue to issue and region to region, where we are a very large country. So I think, some of the big wins historically, at the time that the conflicts were going on, the mainstream of Canadian opinion was against the movement, right? So I would go back, actually just wrote a media piece with a couple of colleagues about the lessons of forestry protests from the early 1990s that we might take for pipeline protests in Canada now. And at the time, in Western Canada, you saw the largest civil disobedience ever, but it was like 800 people. Got arrested. A few thousand people would maybe show up to the biggest rallies, but that was still a minority, right? And the mainstream of public opinion took a while to change. It took lots of media coverage to change. That for the most part, people in British Columbia at the time were pro-forestry. If you fast forward 25 years, the mainstream of public opinion in Western Canada is like, wow, it's a really good thing we protected our old growth forests, and that we now have like a really vibrant tourism economy and outdoor rec economy that forestry communities actually make more from now than they would have if they kept just logging everything, right, in terms of industrial forestry. So it can be really hard to tell in the midst of a campaign that when you, getting old enough now that I'm starting to have the benefit of hindsight, because I was part of those protests in the early 90s around forestry practices, and it's like, yeah, okay, with 20 years, what seemed like a minority voice that did win some really great protections becomes mainstream opinion 20 years later, right? And I think our point in the piece we just wrote about the pipeline protests is, you know, the mainstream of Canadian opinion right now, outside of British Columbia, is supportive of the pipelines being built, of expanding our pipeline infrastructure. In British Columbia, the majority of opinion is probably against it, but the federal government is kind of siding with Alberta. So it's very hard to tell in the midst of it, but I think, you know, when you get the media coverage, where you start to actually get some international attention to these issues, I think where you have groups that can actually leverage not just, you know, protests on the ground, but also leverage the court system. That helps a lot. But I think what you'll see is, you know, the groups that are successful now, even if they're not the majority opinion today, in 10 years they might be the majority opinion, right? That the pendulum does shift, I think, and I'm being optimistic now, but hopefully that'll be the case, the same way that we've seen with forestry practices in Canada. Hopefully in 10 years we'll see something similar with fossil fuel economies. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay. Then I think we can finish the event.
Right.
First, thank Professor Stoddart. And before we conclude, just a few remarks on upcoming event. So now there is a 30-minute break. Then there is a discussion with Tomasz Tomašević from the Left Platform from Zagreb. And the evening we have a screening of the film Resistance about EcoPro, Slovenian social movement that fought against Lafarge cemetery factory. And the film is also a very good start for tomorrow's discussion with one of the great leaders of this fight, Uroš Maceran. So thank you again and have a nice time.